Hello everyone, this is Dan again, here at Dan's Astrology, and I'm making another video, this time about Pluto and Aquarius, and my last video that I made was about Pluto and Aquarius, and I was doing it on my computer, looking at my astrology software, going through the transits that are going to be made in this big chunk of time, this 20-year approximate chunk of time that Pluto is going to be in Aquarius. And I guess after doing that, I still just have this on my mind. I didn't go so far into analyzing the actual meaning of what Pluto and Aquarius means, so I'm going to do some of that today. I have to admit I have a lot of ideas on my mind, and I don't know if I'll get to all of it in this video. And I feel perhaps a little bit disorganized or chaotic in my approach, but one of the things that I have to emphasize here is that when I'm making these videos, I notice there's a certain style that some people like to do with making videos, right? And it's that either they're highly edited or they're made in such a way where you can tell that all the material is written up in advance and the person's basically just reading off a teleprompter, right? Now, I have a different kind of style where I'm not going into it with nearly this kind of preparation, but I have been making notes, I have been writing things, I do things too, like I will write out a list of things which could be thematically relevant, and then I will draw tarot cards for each of these themes and see which scores, and there's certain, this is kind of, I've been doing this for the Pluto and Aquarius to see which themes or which archetypes are most relevant. And I have to also admit, there's the feeling, I did record a video recently about with my reaction to the recent American election, and I have to admit that I'm kind of on the fence when it comes to how much I should be involved with the whole thing about politics, because specifically, I'll just, quite frankly, I am not a fan of Elon Musk, and that is, the fact that Elon Musk is on Trump's team, well, who knows where this is going to go over the next few years, because Trump does have this pattern of starting off with a team and then alienating or you know, like, his teams don't usually tend to, like, maintain the same, you know, he tends to alienate his allies and stuff like that, right? So, you know, maybe a different story in a few years from now, but as is, I just, like, to make it as plain and simple as possible, I, for one thing, am somebody who doesn't really like Elon Musk, or who's not a fan of that particular brand of politics that the Trump MAGA movement is going for. And on top of this, too, is that I'm a person who has my own... I may as well just be, like, upfront about having, like, mental health challenges and stuff like that. And there's been times where I've just felt like it's been, for the sake of my own sanity, you know, it's better to avoid getting into this, like, highly inflammatory things, because especially when it's like, I think, but there's something about Pluto that goes with this, because Pluto can stand for that really strong thing of just, like, of really hating something, right? But it's like there's problem that George Orwell tried to warn about, right? With you know, like in 1984, where they have, like, the hour of hate or whatever, where they put the they train you to hate a certain person, and then they put the person's face on the screen, and everybody, we really don't like this person. So this kind of thing that even if there's something about it, it's like, even if I have my own opinions and preferences in terms of politics, that and that even if you know, rationalize or justify being against a certain kind, you don't want to fall into that trap of hating the enemy. And there's this other kind of thing about, like, spirituality, where if you listen to people like Ram Dass would talk about this back in the days of George W. Bush, about how as a person with political preferences, he was obviously very against George W. Bush, but still he had to, his spiritual path, he didn't want to make it to create that trap of hating somebody like that, right? And there's something, Pluto does stand for that, I think, right? So there, I'm just putting that is an issue, first of all, with the planet Pluto, the archetype of Pluto, and with that in mind, though, you look at what we're dealing with in terms of somebody like Elon Musk being a wealthy billionaire, one of the richest men in the world, who's a kind of a celebrity or whatever. You've got this idea of the word Pluto and the word plutocracy, right? That this idea that the language of Pluto, it runs directly into the language of extreme wealth, and the plutocracy is of the power that comes with extreme wealth, of being a successful business person, and basically they're putting, at this point in time, they're putting Musk and some other guy who I'm not as familiar with, named Vivek Ramaswamy or something. I can't remember what his name is. I don't know these guys very well, but it seems like they are going on this kind of neoliberal style of running the government like a business, right? And one of the things about this is that the branding, the image of the word liberalism has fallen out of favor to some degree, anyways, or at least as a Canadian, here the liberalism is associated with centrism. That is basically, if you are the left wing and the right wing tend not to like liberalism or liberal centrism, and well, I mean, it kind of gets complicated with local Canadian politics, but there's this kind of there's something going on that's been on my mind, and I thought I would at least try to approach it in this video. And there's a certain guy who I have to admit is not very popular anymore. Although I have a couple books from him. Like, I read this one, Integral Psychology by Ken Wilber. And Ken Wilber was just drawing off of a whole bunch of other thinkers. And I think when it comes to this, the basic integral idea, a lot of people also go to Gene Gebser, although I have to admit I haven't read any Gebser yet. But there's this basic idea of integral stages, right? And the idea that Wilber himself was interviewed around the time after Trump won his first election, talking about how the predominance of Trump-style politics has to go with the problems at the level of what they call the green level of development, right? And the thing about, there's this, I'm doing an astrology channel here, so to get into this color-coded system of development is a, I don't want to spend all the time breaking that down, but the basic idea is that prior to the green is this level called orange, prior to orange is a level called blue, and then it gets more complicated because there's different systems of color coding. So the blue is called mythic, orange is called rational, and green is called pluralistic or postmodern, right? So, and there's this basic idea that a great example of this, where you could imagine the post-war period, right? And that there's a certain degree of rationalism, of scientific understanding that led to such things as the invention of nuclear power, of the advancement of technology during the war, of you can imagine your kind of atomic age of 1950s, better living through science, and rationalism and industry and stuff like that, and kind of the optimism that came with that. And this is also being a kind of a fulfillment of what happened in the Renaissance, basically, right? Or what they call the Enlightenment era, right? And it was a development away from a previous stage of development, which is coded as being the blue mythic. And the basic idea is that the blue mythic is much more concerned about things like would be associated with tradition, right? And understanding, the world from the perspective of having a religious authority that has a kind of strict kind of role system that has traditional gender roles, traditional hierarchies, all this kind of stuff, and everything, and things have to be a certain way because the Bible says so, right? And then from this you have a rationalistic society that has a new kind of regime of science that kind of puts the old high order of a mythic religious society in question, and the Enlightenment offers this kind of Enlightenment rationality offers a kind of a liberation from the old dogmas of the the kind of religious traditionalism and stuff like that, right? And there are people like unfortunately, out of this, you also had things like the French Revolution. You even had like things like the French revolutionary thinking, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. All this kind of stuff is this kind of modern movement away from the idea that you had a king as the God given representative of as a monarch leader of a society is basically this mythic level of development, right? Where the king isn't elected through a rational process, but rather a mythic process. You've got a mythic king who is like, you can have somebody who's born into a long lineage, and it's their like God-given chosen right to be that person, and it's like the Pope and there's a sort of theocracy that goes with this level where the church and state has not been so separated. And then the next development you have in rationalism, you now have a ability to have a rationally enlightened society that's free from the dogmatic restrictions of the previous society, but there's some conflict there, right? And which interesting thing about America, in American politics, is that a large chunk of what makes the American population to begin with were religious fundamentalists who left England because they were considered too extreme in the sense of being kind of like these of that kind of mythic structured fundamentalists, right? And this basically makes the backbone of the Bible Belt and all these people that are going to vote for the fundamentalist right wing, right? Now, what's interesting about Donald Trump is that, or I don't know about Donald, maybe we're not going to get hung up on Donald Trump so much here, but the idea of the Trump-Musk association is that you've got liberalism is something different, right? Because liberalism is more concerned about making money, first of all, running the government. So this is the whole thing. Are you going to run the government like a church, right? Like a kind of a church institution, or like a kingdom, or are you going to run the government like a business? Right, and sometimes there's certain sort of people try to carry this over, like the right-wing aristocracy is now a business aristocracy, and they just kind of inherited some of their position and power from these. But the basic idea of this is that you've got these structures don't really go away, but rather these are latent structures that one builds on top of the other. Right? There's this kind of idea that like our kind of what we experience as modernity is very much defined by this rationalist structure, but that's built on top of a mythic structure that kind of hides underneath it, right? And then underneath the mythic structure, they have what's called the magical structure, and they have what's called the archaic structure, right? And the thing about this idea is that, for one thing, okay, Pluto often has to do with, people talk about evolution with Pluto, right? But they also talk about Pluto in terms of power and in terms of concentrations of power that could be corrupt, and the plutocracy of people who come to power through enormous amounts of wealth and privilege and stuff like that. And the idea that there was a promise in the Enlightenment, the Western Enlightenment, that there was a certain kind of emancipatory potential of this movement towards a rationalistic society, right? And that the emancipatory potential means that you weren't just fixed into this role. Like, if you were born into a caste system or something like that, or if you were born into if you were born a peasant, you were just going to be a peasant. There's no social mobility. If you were born into an aristocratic family, you're going to live your life as an aristocrat. There was no social mobility. All that really sense of a fixed, rigid class society of aristocracy, of peasants, of laborers, of where people are each really fixed into a category, is indicative of the role system of the mythic stage of development, right? And the rationalistic society opens that up to, so if you were inclined to mobilize yourself into a different class strata, it was at least seen as everybody. There's a sort of principle that came out of that everybody should have a fair shot. That if anybody wanted to become prime minister, they could, or anybody wanted to become president, everybody has a fair shot at doing that, and you're not just locked into this rigid power structure that sort of self-justifies itself by having a pope that says everything is the way it is because God decrees it be that way, right? There's something about all this that maybe I'm getting off track. Wilber basically talks about the falling back to Trumpism as a kind of a regression away from, or running, maybe not a regression, but running into the problems inherent with the level of the line of development that goes beyond the rational stage of development into the what you call the green stage, which is pluralistic and postmodern. And specifically, Jordan Peterson has a reputation of raging against the problems about postmodernism and stuff like that. But in himself could be seen as a kind of a postmodern kind of character, but a person who, I was just watching a recent video the other day. I'll leave a link in the description, I guess, about where Peterson or Wilber is talking about how Peterson has basically become associated with instead of an integral vision of religion, regressing back to the mythic, or trying to there's these basically conflicts that happen between the mythic and the rational, and then from the rational and the postmodern, right? And Peterson originally got set up at this, it's like this fault line of controversy, right? There's a fault line of controversy around transgender stuff, and Jordan Peterson used this particular fault line to catapult himself into success. And since then, he doesn't really approach that fault line. What he does is he's fallen back onto a different fault line, the fault line between the mythic and the rational. And this is why I brought up in my other video that Jordan Peterson recently had this debate with Richard Dawkins, right? And this is a prime example. The Dawkins debate is interesting because it's a prime example of Jordan Peterson trying to work out the conflicts between what you call mythic and rational, and just leaving the whole problem of the pluralistic postmodern off the table, right? So the idea is instead of pushing forward into the problem with pluralistic postmodernism, we are retreating backwards to deal with the Richard Dawkins modernists, basically, right? And so, and basically, what's happening is that the level of Richard Dawkins level modernism is fortifying itself, solidifying itself, and working out the problems it has with the previous latent stage of mythic traditionalism, basically, right? And there is a and what I find what's particularly interesting about this is that you can see this problem also in Elon Musk and Elon Musk's own basically the divorce with Grimes and the family conflict Elon Musk has with transgender children in his own family. Being this kind of like point of this kind of like ne plus ultra, which is like Pluto in another way, right? There's like the river Styx, right? There's this like kind of like the river Styx between the world of the living and the world of the dead, and there's this kind of like this idea of this dreadful thing that you cannot cross, right? That you cannot go farther past this point. And like this is the line of development that we've hit, where you have a wealthy billionaire who's made a there's also, at some level, green is also associated with an interest in environmentalism, and there's kind of a weird irony in that in some sort of context, the Elon Musk electronic vehicle Tesla kind of situation could be seen as this is the orange or the rationalist, industrial, business-oriented mindset trying to push forward at the leading edge of development to deal with the climate crisis, right? But at the very same time, there's a kind of like we've done as much as we can in this direction of like coming up with like technological solutions for climate change, and now we've hit this wall where we're like we're not going to do windmills, right? There's like Trump and Musk for some reason hate windmills. They hate like they don't like solar panels either, I guess. I don't know. There's some kind of thing where there's this like Elon Musk did do you have to admit that at one point in time it seemed like the oil industry was completely dominant, and there was nobody was considering electric power to be an option at all, and Elon Musk did that job, right? The idea was that like we used to have our rationalistic, industrial, scientific regime kind of like at this level where we had a lot of scientists who were really concerned about climate change, and then a bunch of people being like skeptics and being like, well, I don't know, maybe we don't have to believe, maybe they're not true, right? Maybe climate change, maybe we don't have to worry about climate change. Maybe it's all just fake or something like that, right? And then being like, okay, well, maybe like we're not going to get or whatever. Talking about oil dependency and all this, right? That there's at least Elon Musk was able to push that a little bit further to get over the oil dependency thing and embrace electric technology, and then you can see where you're like, okay, we've made a bit of progress, and then but you've got a transgender child. Oh fuck, that's too much. Like it's like you've just pushed it too far, right? Like you can't have you can't make the jump from oil to electric vehicles and then have also the CEO have a transgender child. It's just too much to do all at once, right? And so we've kind of hit this point where we can't go any farther than that. And we're in the state of a kind of this mass. I don't know, maybe I'm kind of joking around here but this is the situation that we're dealing with, right? There's something about what Wilber talks about as like it's like the failure of this pluralistic level, right? And the pluralism could be seen in a number of ways, where you have at the mythic blue stage, you have a myth, you have this sort of archetypal imprint, right? Or you have the this is what a man should be, this is what a woman should be, we have this whole like biblical stories of Sodom and Gomorrah or like all this kind of heavy religious traditionalism over like what the norms of a sexual reproduction or the norms of family life or all this kind of stuff is sort of set in, and there's as this substructure that's created by the traditionalists. And the problem with America is that America skews this way because there were so many of these Amish, Quakers, Mormons, all these kinds of weird religious fundamentalists who established America or established this kind of underlying bedrock, right? And then Trump. What's interesting about Trump though is that for everybody who likes to play up this thing about Trump being a kind of like a cult leader or something like that, but Trump is actually appeals more to this idea of, what did he get famous for? The Apprentice, right? Or it could be like a kind of a myth or an imagined thing that he's a really good businessman or something, but he's still, that is the image he's trying to work with. He's not trying to work with, he's like a guru cult leader. He's trying to say, I'm a good businessman, and we're going to get these other guys who are good businessmen to run the government like a business, which itself is this is basically an orange mentality or a rational mentality thing that but they have to appeal to this inner division in their own structure, right? Which is that you've got in the conservative movement is going to have some people who are relating to it more from a rational perspective and other people relating from a mythic fundamentalist perspective, right? And the idea of is that there's some kind of also this threat to, or this kind of risk when you get into the idea of the structures that are more latent than that, right? And one of the prime example would be you see this image of the QAnon Shaman, right? The guy who has the big bull horns or whatever, or the January 6th thing, right? There's something about the shaman. If you take the shamanic thing seriously, then you can see that you've got this, and the idea is that we're not talking about the hierarchy in terms of a whatever. There's this kind of thing. There's certain spiciness perhaps due to the idea of a vertical hierarchy, right? And this is probably why Wilber had some degree of sympathy for Peterson, is because there's a kind of the pluralistic perspective sometimes has a problem with this hierarchy, right? Because the hierarchy says that underneath the mythic fundamentalist kind of level is the magical and the archaic, right? And the idea here is that the shaman is operating at the magical, archaic structures, which are even more buried at the foundation, right? There's a good. I'm trying. Why does this all relate? Why am I bringing this up for Pluto and Aquarius? Is it? I don't know who's watching this. If you guys can see where I'm going with this or not, right? What's coming to mind, anyways, to explain this is there's a story from the popular horror writer H.P. Lovecraft, right? And H.P. the one I'm thinking of specifically is a story called Rats in the Walls, right? And Rats in the Walls, it's been a while since I read it, but it describes a guy who's living in some kind of an old house or whatever, and that he's disturbed. It's kind of funny because, well, I won't get into it, but there's like if you've ever lived in a house that has rats in the walls, it can be a little bit creepy when you hear funny noises and stuff like that. So it basically starts on that kind of sensation, that feeling of horror, of being creeped out by the rats in the walls. And there's a kind of, it's like a structural horror story where the guy investigates this old house and finds out there's a sort of basement area, and that underneath the basement there's a secret. It actually goes down further, and there are catacombs, right? And then as you keep exploring the catacombs, you go further and further, and it just gets. Then you start getting into Lovecraftian eldritch horror. It's like the iceberg, right? You know the iceberg meme where you have your tip of the iceberg, and then you descend the depths, right? The idea that Pluto or Hades is the underworld, right? And the idea that you have your this could stand for a number of different things, right? But I'm bringing up this H.P. Lovecraft story because there's this idea that we have our modernist reality, right? This sort of modern rational reality that we all are familiar with. But the idea is that we could use this kind of developmental hierarchy as a way of instead of making it into something that's very kind of like in this kind of petty, like we're, superior, inferior, more evolved, less evolved kind of thing. You could look at it in this way of that there's always a kind of a substructure underneath in the depths, right? And that even the rational scientist has the mythic structure in the unconscious, in the underworld, relative to the day world that you could be like it's like the hidden cellar you don't know about with all this stuff that even there's something about it too that even if you are rejecting the old religion or the old superstitions, then these things can be like the things that are you have disowned and are hiding in your basement, right? The idea that when it comes to shamanism or whatever, you've got this idea of a developmental structure where if you go pre-Christianity to this, or you go to Socrates, and then people often talk about Socrates and the pre-Socratics as basically being like kind of a shamanism, right? And that there's some kind of like a phase of early prehistory that everybody shared this kind of like similar shamanic ancestry, and that goes way back into our root. And there's certain things where you get like the old cave paintings, where you go way into prehistory and you get these cave paintings where people were painting buffalo and stuff like that, and then you have things like these early images, almost like Minotaur or something like that, these human animal hybrids. And that this, as we can point and laugh at the Qanon Shaman, but this was something that the Qanon Shaman was playing off of, right? That the people who get into this stuff are like, as you go far enough into the depths, you reach this sort of hidden, or this underlying shamanic substructure in the depths of all of it, and that is something that in our there's this whole other fault line there, right, between the archaic, we're gonna go. The archaic is something even different, right? But the archaic is usually called red, right, and the magical shamanic is usually called purple, right? When you get this division between purple and blue as well, where you've got the idea between like a kind of a paganistic nature religion versus the institutions of the Catholic Church and stuff like that, right? And the change that happened there, and there being certain fault lines of like trying to convert the pagans into Christians, and the pagans trying to keep their own indigenous religions. And there's certain things that with voodoo, often what they did is they took their African gods and made them into Christian saints, so that they could keep practice, that they could integrate their old religions with Christianity, and sort of, and so there's certain things that are like in all these stages you can set yourself up on one of these fault lines and try to mediate between them, but the leading edge of where we are running into that problem right now is between the orange or the rationalistic and the pluralistic postmodern. Which you see is the culture war, unfortunately, where you have reactions against trans people, against gay people, and you have a trend away from multiculturalism. You have a general attitude that's less friendly towards immigration, all that kind of stuff. You're all seeing this as a result of the movement away from the kind of a regression away from the leading edge into this pluralistic postmodern line of development, right? And the idea is that there's always this tendency to sort of like take one to make one stage the center, right? The place where your center of gravity is situated, and the idea is that the center of gravity in Western society has regressed away from the green stage into this orange stage, and there's a kind of a tendency to backslide even further into this kind of traditional religious fundamentalist thing. But the main thing is that the conservatives, what you call, the idea of the word liberalism is kind of fallen out of favor. But the main idea with liberalism is that liberalism is built around this rationalistic Enlightenment values. The freedom of the individual over like heavy-handed systems of dogmatic control and domination and stuff like that. But in order to create a voting structure, you need to make a deal to get everybody voting. You need to get your ability to make. This is the main thing about this is funny is that you look at this fault line with the early people who left England and came to settle in America. You might have had a lot of people like the Amish who reject technology, right? And this is where there's a sort of fault line. Pluto. I'm just talking about Pluto is a great thing to understand these fault lines, right? Because you imagine being Amish and having this sense of like pressure to transform. You have to give up your way of life to get a car, to get a phone, to get an internet connection, to get all. But you're like, no, we're going to set up this firm barrier to say no to this, and we're going to hold out at this center of development, and because there's something about this that works for us. I mean, rather than saying it, this whole thing, you don't have to take it as being absolutely true. But the problem is there's always this tendency for each of these stages to take themselves as being some sort of like, we've really got it, right? Because the way that scientists have this tendency to look at science, like the practice of science is coming to an objective truth, right? And an objective truth is something that you can't argue about, right? That from a scientific point of view, anything you can measure or anything you can take measurements on so that you can have a bunch of other people repeating the same experiment, repeating the same results, having the same mutual conclusion based on scientific method is a certain form of objectivity. And we say, this is true, this is real. And those kinds of people look at people who are religious and say, one person has one holy scripture, the other one has another culture has another holy scripture. I'm sorry, but this is not, you guys are claiming that you guys have some sort of absolute total truth based on your faith. But to us, it just looks like, some subjective cultural belief systems where one group of people likes to believe this, one group of people likes to believe this, and they don't have any hard objective science. And Jordan Peterson has set himself up in trying to work on that level between the mythic and the rational, right? The problem is that the pluralistic has this way of, there's this problem with I will get to the point here, right? Totalitarianism. Because the idea is that I have to admit in a previous video I started talking about Pluto as being a planet associated with fascism. And I was thinking about whether I should get into this problem. I guess I'm doing it now. The problem with fascism is that it's become this kind of highly charged thing that that you use to put down or dismiss or make an enemy out of somebody by accusing them of because it's such an extreme and outrageous thing, right? And based on what the people who were fascists did do extreme and outrageous things. So it's an extreme and outrageous thing for a reason, because it's associated with some extreme and outrageous behavior, right? And so I don't really like to, totalitarianism is another thing which is fairly extreme, but it's not just limited to having a totalitarian government like North Korea, right? North Korea, you can imagine just the amount of control, the amount of oppression, all this kind of stuff, it does go with the theme of Pluto, right? Totalitarianism. There's this idea, though, about like totalitarianism in a governmental sense is taking the power of the authority and creating an absolute out of that. That the authoritarian power is an absolute total power. Their way to structure and order society is tries to be an absolute total structuring of society. And there's this kind of thing that when it comes to these developmental stages, you could have a religious fundamentalist form of totalitarianism where anybody who disagrees with your religious dogma is a witch to be burnt at the stake, a heretic or something like this, an infidel. Or else you could have a scientific form of totalitarianism in which everything which is true is what we reach at through an objective scientific method, and that there are decisions about how we structure society need to be done off of a kind of a liberal, evidence-based scientific approach, where instead of just doing something because we want to do it, you have to present through experiments and studies, and we can demonstrate why we should take this choice of action over another based on having some objective hard evidence rather than just having like this is what the tradition says we should do, right? But the thing is, if you say that thing has to dominate all ways of life, then there's a risk, even if that sounds good to you, that could become a form of totalitarianism if you make that a totalizing principle, right? If you take that everything we do has to be governed by that kind of way of looking at things, and that at the exclusion of other ways of looking at things, it becomes totalitarian, right? And the idea of the pluralistic postmodern is to say that regardless, you may not, what I find there's some sort of irony here is because you still have this problem of pluralism inherent to the conservative establishment, because now you have a bunch of, here you could have kind of a bunch of an immigrant population. You can have the kind of irony that comes from having a whole bunch of Latino people vote for Trump, right? Or having a whole bunch of people who would be considered to be minorities vote for the person who is all about tight border control and stuff like that, right? There's the idea that, like, even if you're against multiculturalism seeps in through the back door, or sneaks in through the back door, right? That like you can either consciously decide to be like, how are we going to deal with the fact that we have a multiple perspectives coming into the situation, or also you can say we're not into that. We're just into like the business, money is the god, right? Whoever can make money, who can run things efficiently and productively, wins. This is the kind of Elon Musk run the government like a business level that happens at this rationalistic level, right? And the problem about that is that inherent to that is that from a rationalistic perspective, first of all, okay, you might have the rationalistic scientific perspective is great for coming up with new technologies that solve problems. One specific example of these kinds of technologies that solve problems could be the technology of birth control, contraception, that kind of thing, right? Whereas, it's interesting that just very recently, also, there was this thing where women were so many women died in childbirth, right? That there's this kind of idea that sex itself, promiscuity. Well, one of the reasons why sex was judged to be like this dirty, shameful thing was that, like, if you went fooling around with random people, you could either contract a disease and die. It's still a danger, obviously, right? But you could if you got pregnant, you could die in childbirth, right? So there's always this whole thing about like sex and death being connected, but with the from the mythic level, right? There could be this religious tradition that says to have a happy life, We want to avoid these. We have to have everybody be chaste and not promiscuous and all this. And then from a rationalist point of view, you're like, you know, that makes sense in terms of like have a strategy to avoid these illnesses. But what if you used a condom? What if you had these different or like you have birth control, right? You have all these, so that the consequences of your promiscuous behavior are not something that you have to rely to an old dogmatic religion to protect you to start. You can now have scientific solutions, right? That you can have as much sex as you want without worrying about getting pregnant, or you can protect yourself from potential infections with condoms, all these kinds of things, right? That the scientific, like, they're kind of like, the problem with this kind of thing is that the rational scientific thing has this kind of like disruptive quality, where the old structures are now disrupted, or that, you know, that you also have this idea of being free to divorce, right? That the old fundamentalist mythic structure would have a very rigid idea about you know, not divorcing, and as you start to move into the age of enlightenment, now people can have as many, you know, you can go through as many marriages as you want, right? But this starts to breed a kind of like the problem is that this naturally starts to give rise to a different kind of situation where you may have some people who've life experience is based on this whole this influence of these traditional norms of what life is supposed to be like, or else you could be living in a world where your whole reality is defined by not being under pressure to adhere to those norms, right? And that you having a you can have people insisting that life has to be a certain way, or it does, or whatever, right? You're going to have inevitably out of this, you're going to have different perspectives. You're going to have a multiplicity, right? You're going to, or you're going to have a bunch of people immigrating from different countries who all have these kind of old traditional views or traditionalist centers of gravity, but they don't get along, and they're going to go to war with each other, going to go fight with each other, right? So they're based on these religious differences and stuff like that. Or like, and you can see that I don't know. I mean, don't want to get too much into, but this is all. There's something about Pluto that has to do with these fault lines and trying to, like, our kind of evolution is kind of getting over these differences, or trying to, like, integrate each of these like, the idea is that eventually you get into an integral stage where all these things, instead of being at odds with each other, are actually working coherently together and are not seen as being structures which are inherently at odds with each other. But what I'm just noticing in the general cultural climate is that we've backed away from the pluralistic postmodern stage, and we're in this sort of thing where, like, we're not even going there because people are so hung up on this kind of Richard Dawkins level of, like, is the Bible literally real, right? Which is like going through this, like, the blue level, or the mythic level gets stuck on this problem of mythic literalism, right? And whereas you could have a more developed approach where you can appreciate that things don't have to, you could read it literally, but there's many different ways of which you can approach something, right? And that a kind of a fairy tale literalism is perhaps one of the most basic and undeveloped ways to approach something. But even our people who are apparently, like, scientists are so, like, they're caught up in these basic things where you have a rational and you have a mythic that are completely at odds with each other, and then you have a pluralistic postmodern that is also completely threatening, and there's no sign of integration at all. Everything's completely disintegrated right now, right? And the idea that, like, we're to the point where these people are, like, we're electing leaders, like people like Elon Musk, who are their own families are disintegrated. We have people who are in these, like, situations, rather than having a you have a divorced family with transgender kids, and your whole politics is like your family life is a fucking mess. You can't resolve the pluralistic conflict in your own family, so you have to go at this kind of like a hard-edged, like rationalist businessman kind of money and power kind of like Ayn Randian libertarian thing. It's like this. And again, I'm sorry if this is a mess. I'm trying, like, I hope, like, maybe you can, like, leave some comments and tell me how I'm doing with this one. But this is what's on my mind going into this, right? The idea that there's, like, the conflicts between each stage of development are very Plutonian. And mainly the resistance, there's this kind of evolutionary edge where there's this kind of strong aversion or resistance from one stage to another, right? And I've been running into this with my family, because, or in the sense that, like, I'll give the example that my mother, I feel, is very much a good example of somebody who's centered at the rationalistic, has a very strong rationalistic center. And I have to admit that, like, I have this thing where I have an interest in things to do with, like, theology and psychology and Carl Jung and all this kind of stuff. But that from somebody who's at the rationalistic center of development basically just has this kind of thing where they see, when they think about religion, they think about religion as being a regression into the sort of mythic earlier stage of development, or also like the whole, or like there's the way that rationalist people tend to like turn their nose up to things like shamanism or something like that. That is like there's some kind of like strong disgust or aversion to like regressing to like some kind of like superstitious pre-modern like like you're throwing throwing I Ching coins and reading you're like, what, like a scientist, there's certain kind of scientist that would just get the heebie-jeebies or get the creeps from that, right? And I think there's something about Pluto which is like that kind of like aversion, which is not really rational, but comes from this thing that like you've been conditioned that like in order to survive in society, you have to present yourself in this rationalistic way, and that if you try to like, talk to your boss about like, hey boss, I threw some I Ching coins about like what we should do for our new plan for the and they'll be like, get this guy out of here. You need, or like send him to the psych ward, right? Like there's this kind of like thing about like the like the regression. There's this kind of like, it seems this from the rational point of view, the regression into religion or the regression into like, and I mean, there's something about divination which like gets right into this, because divination is going back to these ancient, archaic kind of modes of being and understanding and stuff like that. And there's a certain, I'm just saying that I've supported, but I just find it an interesting problem. Because in some way my family is like friendly and supportive of this idea, but I keep noticing this thing coming up with my mother about being like, she talks about like friends of hers in high school who became Jesus freaks, right? The aversion to the Jesus freak, and the kind of like there's this kind of thing going into Pluto and Aquarius with the recent election in the States, and this kind of there's these two forces at play, right? The rationalistic force, which is all about capitalism, which is all about science and engineering and technology and advancement, and then this other one, which is the traditionalist force, which is like, instead, like, this is the whole thing. We're in this cultural moment where instead of embracing, the pluralistic thing is like, would be embracing transgender people, embracing multiculturalism, but for some reason, instead of doing that, there's more of this falling back onto the mythic traditional structure, which is already part of American politics because the right wing has always relied on that for part of its vote, right? And the whole problem about gender politics, about the rights to abortion and all this kind of stuff, Trump is actually more of a rationalist because he doesn't care. Trump himself doesn't have much of a stake in this. He doesn't care that much about abortion and access to contraception. Like that is, but he has to. Yeah, he has to work that line between the. I'm probably just repeating myself now, right? But you can see what I'm saying, right? And that there's there's some kind of there's some kind of an exile process that takes place, right? Where until we reach integration, until we try to move more towards an integral state of development, what we're going to have is we're going to have a center that takes itself to be totalizing, while at the same time making exiles out of all the things it doesn't accept, right? Like you have a rationalist who is like, this is what's true, this is what's real, and anything that just, religious and superstitious and make-believe is going to be exiled into our dungeon, which is equivalent to being like the H.P. Lovecraft story, The Rats in the Walls, right? Where there's some kind of like, we live in a house and the cellar goes down to this weird crypt and there's this kind of weird tunnels, but we just have to cover that up and pretend that doesn't exist and think positive, guys. Don't think about the weird mummy that's buried beneath the floorboards that's going to cut. But then like that's kind of like this is my at least attempt to tell you in archetypal terms what's going on in the collective psyche during this Pluto and Aquarius ingress. I have a lot of other ideas that I didn't really get to in here, but this is what's been on my mind recently. I'm going to just end it here because it's been an hour. Thanks for watching.